Hello and welcome to a chapter on access control fundamentals. So, in today's lecture, we're going to define the access control and the list of four access control models. And I think you should definitely remember them because they always come up on the Security Plus certification exam. And we're going to describe the logical access of the control methods in details. We're going to explain the different types of physical access control. And we're going to talk about the authentication services, like the radius service and the TACACS service and so on, for remote access. All right, so it's very important for the foundation in information security to authenticate users, of course. I mean, 50%, if not more, of people breaking into networks and systems is by stealing their passwords, believe it or not. So you having a username and a password is extremely important. So we have to verify approved users and validate them, and we're going to control their access, what they are going to be authorizing, and we're going to keep track of what they have been authorized to do, keep an account of what they're supposed to be doing. All right, so we're going to talk about the terminology and the four different standards of control methods, models that there are out there, and we'll talk about some best practices. All right, so granting or denying, what is control access? You want to be able to either permit or deny users from either accessing a physical plant or the physical device, or logically having access to some resources within the network. So we can use either firewalls. Mostly we use firewalls to do that on the computer, but we can use TACACS servers, as we will discuss later on, for just authentication purposes. We can use the radius servers on the physical front. We can have an actual security guard standing there. But you have to have that, how you are going to do it. So we'll talk about the four different standard models that are out there. Okay, so let's look at some terminologies first so you'll understand exactly what we're talking about. Identification means presenting your credentials, who you are, what's your username, what's your password. Give me your employee badge, for example, if you are coming into the physical um, facility. Authentication is validating the username and password. So typically, you'll have your if it's on the logical on the server, your username and password will be stored in a database. So when you are prompted for a username and a password, once you type those in, they are sent to the database on the server, and they'll validate you. They authenticate to make sure that what you have typed in is correct. If that is true, then you are authorized. Authorized depending on who you are and what department you are from, you are giving specific access to certain resources. That's what authorization, you've been authorized. Then after that, then you are going to be what's called accounting, which is not up here. Accounting is to make sure that we keep track of what you have been authorized to do, a list of everything that you did. So this way, if you deviated and went somewhere else and did something other than that you were authorized to, we'll be able to know that. All right, so I please list those down. The basic steps in access control: you have to identify, authenticate, authorize, and then give access, of course. All right, more terminologies. The object is a specific resource. It could be a hardware, it could be a file, it could be the printer, it could be your PC. So those are the ones that we want you, for example, to have access to. The subject is the user. So if you wanted to access a specific workstation, you're the subject, and the object would be the computer. The operation is, what is the subject, going to do? Are they going to delete a file? Is he allowed to write, to read, to remove, to rename a file, for example? Is he only allowed to access the applications and run it? So that's the operation. So a subject wants to do an operation on an object, for example. That's typically what's been done every day. The owner is the person that is responsible for the information. He's the one that creator of the file. So for example, if that file is salary.xlsx, he's the one who created it. That's the owner of the file, and he will have full supervisory privileges on that file. He or she can delete the file, rename it, do whatever they want with it. A custodian is an individual to whom day-to-day actions have been assigned by the owner. So the owner can tell this custodian to do certain things, give him or her some rights on the file of salary. The end user is the one that actually gets to use the file itself. All right, there are 4 different methods. There are the mandatory access control, the MAC, discretionary access control, that's the DAC, and the other 2 are the RBACs, the role-based and the rule-based. So let's talk about the first one, the MAC, the mandatory access. This is the most restrictive type of access. By the way, I want you to type each one of those down. The MAC, the mandatory access control, is the most restrictive. This is where you close everything to everybody. Don't let anyone have any access to anything, and only give them what they need to know. And that's true by what they need to have access to, the resource. So you don't trust anyone with the MAC model. What you do is you disable everything, and whoever, depending on the user that wants to come in, you find out who they are, and they just give them access to that specific resource, and that's it. If you are coming to a physical building, they can, they'll have a badge, and if going into every single room, depending on where you are, you'll have to scan your badge. I remember when I first graduated from college, and I worked at a defense company. It was a guidance and navigation company, and I only had access to my office, my lab, while the cafeteria was open. And when I first got in, I was not have access to anything else but those. I would go into the building, I have access to the lab, to my office, and to the lab, and that was true for many years. So that's really a MAC model, is when there are 2 different implementation. You can use the lattice model and a Bella Bedula model. Those are the 2 types of implication of MAC. So please write those down. We don't have to get into the details. You can write down that the lattice model is subject and objects are assigned on a run. If you are familiar with PLDs, that's what a rung is, from one side to the other. Bell similar to the lattice, but may not create new objects or perform specific functions on the lower objects. We don't need to know really these in details. Just know that these are the 2 different types of implementation of the MAC. All right. Examples of MAC authentication on Windows 7. You have 4 security levels on on the specific users of what they can and cannot do on their files. The read and write, supervisory, I think, if I'm not mistaken, modify, and something else, I'm not sure. But the administrator will be able to set those. Discretionary access control, the DAC, which is number 2, that's the least the least restrictive model. This is a complete opposite of the MAC. Every object has an owner. You can this is like giving access to all resources for everybody. So this way, if you don't want a headache and you don't care about security is not an issue, just do the DAC model. Everybody has, but that's crazy. And even the DAC is not typical. So the MAC and the DAC is typically not really implemented in the IT environment as much, because you don't want to be way too restrictive, because that's really going to keeping you busy, and everybody who needs access to certain things. And of course, having them access to whatever they want as a DAC model, that's also going to give you a big headache too. Uh, the two ways of doing it is really, here's the discretionary access control is when you allow full control, modify, reset and execute, read and write. Everybody gets everything, right? That's a Mac. You don't want to do that. Restrictive means deny everything, right? And just give them maybe just read, depending on what they need. Read the specific file, or maybe read and execute if you just want them to execute a specific application, right? The owner will have all of these rights automatically. The one that created this file will have all of these permissions automatically. All right, number three model is the role based. So the role based is typically what's done, the most widely used, because depending on which department you are in, you'll be able to have some specific permissions to access resources. So if you are a student, you'll have some specific applications that you can use. If you are a faculty member, you'll have different maybe and different permissions. And if you are an administrator and so on. And same thing when you're in an organization, if there's engineering departments, production departments, sales departments. So you break them down on role based, right? And you can create those role-based. You can create organizational units in the Active Directory of Windows Server, and each organizational unit will depend on the role. And then you'll assign those permissions to the organizational units. And if you are a member of those organizational unit, you'll immediately inherit all the rights and privileges that organizational unit has, because your role is an engineer. You should be under the organizational unit called engineering. If your role is within the sales department, you should be under the organizational unit of the sales department, and so on. All right. You can also add typically a rule base. This is, for example, you set certain rules. If you've been here for 10 years, if you are a lab supervisor, if you are an administrator, and if you are in engineering and sales. So if you meet any of these rules, you'll be given certain permissions. So you don't set it towards department. You can have a combination of both. I've seen role-based and rule-based usually go together, because sometimes you may be an engineer but you need access as to certain resources as a manager, so you can set it up as with some rules. That person, if he does most of his work under the engineering department, he'll be in that specific organizational unit. But for one specific user, I can set some rules for them so that excuse me, they'll have access to different resources than the organization that he or she was in. All right, so that's the rule way. So make sure you write all those four down: the MAC, the DAC, and the two RBACs, and what the descriptions they have. All right, the best practices for access control is you want to, number one, separation of duties. Please write those down. This is important, and we're going to discuss each one of them. And it's best that you maybe write the definition of each for what your understandings are. But let's talk about each one of them. Separation of duties. Separation of duties means you want to make sure that not everyone is in control of every single task in the organization. For example, you don't want one person to be the treasury, to take care of the engineering, the productions, everything goes under him, because that's very dangerous. You should separate them. Not unless you are the president, even the owner, the owner of the company. If you have one small company, you should definitely give the roles, to different people. The sales department should have one vice president, the engineering department, the production department. Because if one person control everything, then they got you, it's easy to really manipulate things, and that's not a good idea. So it's definitely done. It's done in the corporate environment. It's done almost everywhere. Even if your company has 50 users, you should definitely separate the duties. Job rotations. Job rotation. When we talk about separation of duties, that means the responsibility of certain things, certain parts of the organization lies on one manager. Job rotations is to get people, managers to do everything. I remember when I was in high school and I was working in a restaurant, the manager used to actually cook. I've seen one of them wash dishes. I've seen them do waitering, all of that. And one of the reasons for that, I mean, their rationale for that was if one of the employee was short, the manager will take over and help out. But they need to know how everything runs so that they know exactly what it takes to perform a specific duty or a specific job. All right, and that's definitely will keep the and then know exactly what goes in and out. For example, if you go in the cashier and see if well, how do they run the cashier, where the cameras are, how does it work, how what this, then you'll know if there is a way to really hide things and commit fraud. Least privileges. It's a good practice to give people the least minimum of access to their resources, and then if they need anything additional, you just raise them up. Implicit deny. Um, if your name does not match any of the entries in a firewall, not to have access, then you're immediately denied, right? If your name is not on the list, either permitted or denied, there's an implicit deny at the end, right? So don't just permit somebody because his name is not on the list. He has to be immediately denied. Mandatory vacations. You're forcing people to leave their job and take a 2-week vacation, for example. Lots of companies do that for the purpose, knowing that if you leave your desk and somebody takes over your duties, there is no way. This is to minimize fraud. That is, I remember that also a question that came on the Security Plus um, certification. Why have mandatory vacations? This is to minimize or mitigate frauds. And it's true. I mean, in banks, they do job rotations and they force people to take vacations. No one back teller tells me that. You can't work there whenever you want to and pick your own vacation. If you can pick your own vacations, but you have to take at least a minimum of, a week or two consecutive days so that you leave your position. So when you leave your position, then, somebody's going to be taking over. You won't be able to hide things. So it's just like I told you earlier in another chapter that auditing, you just let people know that you're going to audit the systems. They behave much, much differently. All right. So those are the examples of the best practices for access control. So you can take the definitions out of here if you want to, or from anything that I said. All right. Access control lists is really entries in the firewall that you can set up to control some rules of who is permitted and who is denied, really. So here's a typical Unix file permission file, Unix file permissions. In Windows, they have the ACE, the access control entry. Then we have the Windows Active Directory that we talked about earlier, where you can set group policies to certain organizational units. Um, Time restrictions, you can set time restriction, time of day, restrictions. You could do that within the Active Directory in Windows. For example, you can tell your employees that you can only have access to the network between 6 a.m. and 6 p.m. Monday to Friday. and then after that, you're not permitted. So at night or anything during the day on the weekends, you will not have access, even though you may have uh, a valid username and password. Okay, so that's important. Please write that down. Account restrictions. You should definitely set the time of day restrictions, unless your company allows people to access their resources 24/7. You definitely should set account expiration. Okay, that's very important. So especially for the ones that are not full time, or I mean they're in there temporarily for 6 months or a year. So set an actual specific time where their account is going to expire. If you need to extend it, you'll extend it down the road, right? So those two things are extremely important. Here's the time of day. You can actually set the time of day when they can and cannot access, and you could do that with the also on your wireless router as well. If you're worried somebody's going to break into your route, access your network while you're sleeping, you can set access to that time wise. Um, Also, you should definitely every once in a while get rid of um, dormant accounts. For example, students are graduated from school, from their college, and what do you do with those accounts? You can't keep them there forever. Maybe keep them maybe 3 months after graduations, and then they have to be deleted. Um, like I said earlier, temp employees, they should not have access to their resources after they leave. I remember I worked for a company and I had access to their network 2 years after I left. Not very good, right? Because I could do anything then. It's either they forgot, but now I'm gone. I mean, it's gone now. But I remember I always had access, remote access too. So definitely you should set expirations. That's in addition to password expiration. This is important. That your password should at least maybe I would say at minimum if 6 months. Every 6 months you should force a password to be changed, because if you just let it sit there, somebody will automatically figure it out. We'll talk about specific passwords later on, but you can control that within your Windows environment, forcing the user to change their password after a periodically after a specific amount of time has elapsed. I think in the college we do it almost every semester or so, if I'm not mistaken. All right, authentication services. There is, you could have a specific server. So when you remotely trying to log in, almost everything is considered to be remote, even though you're on campus. Um, you type in your username and password. It's going to go to a specific server to be validated. Now, that specific server has to do three things: the AAA. All right, so what is the AAA? Write that down. The AAA is authentication, authorization, and accounting. Now, the servers that do that, it's either could be a Kerberos server, the Radius server, the TACACS server, and the LDAP. So Kerberos is not really used as much. It's mostly used in um, universities. Radius is the most popular because it's an open source for anyone to use for remote access. TACACS is mostly used by Cisco. LDAP is within the Windows, the Light Directory. The Windows Active Directory uses it for authentication. So please write down these four types of authentication and AAA servers. So we'll be concentrating a lot on the Radius and the TACACS servers. Down the road, if you need to set up for an organization, most likely you'll do those. I think TACACS Plus now is a little bit, it's open source as well, and you can use it, but it's a Cisco proprietary software. Okay, the remote authentication dial-in user service, the Radius service. So what do you need to know about the Radius service? We'll talk. There's a list I'm going to show you down the road. This is for remote access. If you ever did dial-in in the old days when you dialed into AOL, um, for all your AOL services, when you made a phone call to a server, most likely you went to a Radius service. You typed in your username and password, you were sent there, you were authenticated, and once you were authenticated, they actually authorized you to have access to the internet. And then they kept track, that's authorization. And then after they authorized you, they kept track of when you logged in, when you logged out. They typically not, you could do those two things for accounting, but you can also go into details, which websites you went to and all of that if you wanted to. All right. So when you come in, by the way, so a laptop want to authenticate. So what your authentication is then sent to the TACACS server, the Radius server. I'm sorry. By the way, the access port will not let you in till remember the 802.1x. When you come in and you say I want to be authenticated through a specific port that holds you, they send the information, the username and password or the key to the Radius server. The Radius server will authenticate you. Looking at, they look at the database, and then they come back and they say, all right, he's authorized to have access to so and so, but the Radius server then keeps track of everything, when you're logged in, when you're logged out, or any other information that needs to be logged. All right, so the advantages is you increase security that way with the Radius server, and easier to track usage for billing and keeping network statistics. So it was used a lot in the old days of the dial-up. Kerberos. Kerberos are it was developed in MIT and they use tickets, by the way. So the way it works is when you try to log in, they'll give you a ticket and that ticket cannot be used after that. Because once the ticket expired, you can't use it. This is like you got a ticket for a game or a concert or anything. Once you use that ticket, it's over. If somebody steals it, they won't be able to use it. So that's the advantages of Kerberos. Just remember that definition is they use encrypted tickets and the security about it is once the ticket is expired, it's no longer useful. It's not used as much. It's mostly often used in educational and governmental settings. The TACACS server, the Terminal Access Control System. So this is Cisco proprietary software, you should know. It works exactly like Radius, but it's more secured. It uses TCP instead of UDP. It separates the authentication channel from the authorization from the accounting. Radius binds them together in the same channel, so that may be a little bit less secured. All the data is encrypted, passed back and forth when you are communicating with the TACACS server. So if you use a TACACS server, it's a lot better, much more secured than Radius. But Radius has been around longer and it's an open source for a long time and lots of people have deployed it. So it's a lot more in use. All right, this is I want you to write down the difference between Radius and TACACS, okay, and the different features, okay, because that's important and that's definitely comes up on exams all the time when we're talking about the two different servers that services the AAA, the authentication, authorization, and accounting. All right, the lightweight directory access protocol. This is a directory access protocol that is used by the Active Directory in Windows that stores all the network information, the username, the objects, the printers, the workstations, the servers, everything in a logical tree hierarchical method. So when you type in your username, you are found somewhere in the tree in the hierarchical method. They go and you'll find your username and password, and they can authenticate you, authorize you, and so on. The standard is the X.500 for the LDP. Okay. All right. So the LDAP. So what I want you to write down for the LDP is the X.500 standard defines the protocol for the application to access the DAP, the Directory Access Protocol. But I also want you to write down those 4 points on the LDAP, the Lightweight Directory Access Protocol. It's a simpler subset of DAP designed to run over TCP/IP, has simpler functions and encode protocol elements in a simpler way than the X.500, and it's an open protocol, so anybody can use it. The X.500 is a standard, really, in general, but the LDAP is most usually used in almost all server applications. All right, and that's it. Oh, wow, that's a short chapter. All right, so write down whatever I told, everything that I told you to write down. And until we meet in the next chapter, keep up with the homework, guys. I'll see you then.